Hello. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're at. I'm John Wetzel, the retired sheriff of Oklahoma County, Oklahoma, and chair of the Traffic Safety Committee of the National Sheriff's Association. Let me begin today by thanking Candace Hill, our staff liaison for the National Sheriff's Association Traffic Safety Committee, also to responsibility.org and their vice president, Darren Grondell, the National Alliance to Stop Impaired Driving for their partnership, and in the overall effort to stop impaired driving. And finally, to the presenters who will have presenting here in just a few minutes, but they've taken their time to prepare and to share with us today. So one of the things that we know next is dying in a car crash has become an acceptable way to die in America. Every day, about 125 people lose their lives in motor vehicle crashes, and of those, about 13,000 will die in alcohol-impaired driving crashes. That doesn't even speak to drug-impaired crash victims. We are all aware of the growing impaired driver problem, exacerbated by the proliferation of alcohol and both legal and illegal drugs in America. Next. About a third of all traffic fatalities are a result of alcohol-impaired driving. And in recent years, it's become more difficult to enforce as Americans seem to be increasing their use of potentially impairing drugs. A recent study by NHTSA found that nearly 56% of the injured or killed roadway users tested positive for one or more drugs, and nearly 20% tested positive for two or more categories of drugs. The majority of states now allow the use of medical cannabis, and some also have legalized recreational marijuana. The latter, combined with the opioid crisis that this country continues to battle, along with the use of prescription drugs used by almost 66% of U.S. adults, make it increasingly difficult for law enforcement to detect and enforce drug-impaired driving on our roads. Next.
The driver behind the wheel is 22-year-old Catherine Long. In this first video, you see her make a U-turn on the westbound side and then begin traveling the wrong way. She continued in that direction for the next 11 miles.
There's somebody driving eastbound on the northbound side going about 100 miles an hour.
Troopers who had stopped a suspected drunk driver on the turnpike were told a wrong-way driver was approaching them. In the next video, you see an officer in the road waving, trying to get the attention of Long just before running back to the concrete barrier. Long narrowly misses two cars, then the moment she slams head-on into another car. You then see troopers in the left-hand corner rushing to the scene to try and check on both drivers. Both Long and the driver in the car she hit, 53-year-old Joseph Wallace, died.
Next. It is estimated that over 300,000 people drive drunk every day, and yet only 3,200 are arrested. Next. Increases in drug and multi-substance impaired driving call for the expanded drug testing on the roadside. For officers who are not specifically trained in drug impairment detection, oral fluid screening can help identify drivers that may have recently consumed drugs or would otherwise escape detection. Today, we will hear from a panel of experts who will discuss roadside oral fluid drug testing that offers a convenient and reliable way to screen for substance use without invasive procedures to help identify drug-impaired drivers. This webinar will explain what roadside testing is and isn't, how it is being utilized around the country, and the successes seen in states, with special attention given to Indiana Roadside Oral Fluid Screening Program. Our first presenter is Chuck DeWeese. Chuck is the president of Connecting Clients Consulting in Saratoga, New York. He provides consulting services in traffic safety, including initiatives targeting impaired and distracted driving, traffic enforcement issues, and risky driving behaviors. He has over 30 years experience in federal and state government, including 17 years as a special agent and field office supervisor for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulating the trucking industry. Most recently, Chuck was the Assistant Commissioner of the New York State Governor's Traffic Safety Committee from 2007 to 2022 and chaired the Executive Board of the Governor's Highway Safety Association from 2020 to 2022. Chuck now works with Responsibility.org to promote cannabis green labs and roadside oral fluid screening. We are glad he could join us today. Chuck?
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Sheriff. And thanks to the National Sheriff's Association for the invitation to partner with you folks to put on this webinar. So like the Sheriff said, I was the Highway Safety Office Director in the state of New York for about 15 years, recently leaving that position. And now I'm honored and proud to work for the Vice President of Traffic Safety, Darren Grondell at Responsibility.org. And I just want to talk a little bit. Here's the agenda, what we're going to talk about, who R.org is and what NASID is. Talk very briefly about the scope of the problem. But really, the bulk of the presentation is talking about what is roadside oral fluid testing, how is it being used across the country and the success, and then what you can do to implement it in your state. Next slide. So who is Responsibility.org? If you haven't heard of them, you should get to know who it is and visit this website, www.responsibility.org. Responsibility.org has three missions. R.org is a not-for-profit that's funded by the international distillers, and they have three main missions: to prevent underage drinking, eliminate impaired driving, and that means all forms of impaired driving, whether it's alcohol, drug, or polysubstance. And finally, the third mission is to empower adults to make responsible choices around the use of alcohol. Next slide, please. So if you've never been to the R.org website, I highly urge you to do so after this webinar. There are all kinds of resources on this website that you will find very useful in your line of work. Resources regarding how to conduct a cannabis impairment detection workshop or green lab, resources on law enforcement DUI testimony. There's maps of state laws, guides to implement electronic warrants, and so on. So if you have a minute, take some time to go to that site. Next. So as impaired driving and polysubstance impaired crashes continue to plague our country, a small group of thought leaders created what's called NASID, or the National Alliance to Stop Impaired Driving. NASID is a broad coalition of stakeholders working in a public-private partnership to achieve goals. Our members include law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, toxicologists, safety advocates, and industry leaders. So what has NASID done in its very infancy of only 2 to 3 years? Well, they coordinate and deliver educational webinars on impaired driving. As I stated earlier, they have an annual conference. This year's conference will be in November. So I urge you to look for when those dates are and attend that conference if you can. They create educational resources for practitioners in all fields. They help to build coalitions in your state to help pass laws. And finally, speak at conferences on all types of topics related to impaired driving, including oral fluid testing, cannabis green labs, ignition interlocks, e-warrants, law enforcement phlebotomy, and the list goes on and on. Next slide, please. This slide I'm not going to spend much time on because the sheriff already mentioned it. NHTSA did a study in 2022 that showed almost 56% of injured or killed roadway users tested positive for one or more drugs. To no surprise, the most prevalent drug category detected was cannabis, the active ingredient THC, with 25% of those folks testing positive, followed by alcohol and then stimulants and opioids. But I don't need to tell you that. You're on the roads every single day. You know how bad the drug driving problem is in our country. Next slide. So what tools are available to you to help solve this problem? So what is oral fluid testing? Next slide, please. I'm not going to overcomplicate this. It's very simple. Oral fluid screening technology is very similar to what you see at your at-home COVID tests or pregnancy tests. The analyzers use lateral flow immunoassay technology. What does that mean? It's basically taking the oral fluid from a subject, mixing it with a buffer, very similar to how you do a nasal swab with your COVID test, which mixes with that little buffer they give you in that box. And then the substance is combined and it moves over lateral flow strips and gives you a result of positive or negative. These analyzers are analyzers and not readers. And the difference is that these analyzers actually tell you positive or negative. You're not left at the roadside in the middle of the night when it's snowing out, trying to determine if there's a blue line or not a blue line, how thick is it? It's going to tell you positive or negative to take the subjectivity out of it. The analyzers test for 6 common drugs: THC, cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, opioids, and benzodiazepines. They use a pre-set-off level, cutoff level for each of those drugs, and the results come back within 5 minutes. You have the ability to print the results right there at Roadside, or you can store them in the machine. The technology has built-in quality control checks and procedures to make sure that the unit is operating correctly. There is a positive quality control cartridge and a negative quality control cartridge that takes about 30 seconds to run to make sure the unit is operating properly. Next slide. So here we have a couple photographs of 2 of the vendors that have products. The top one is the Abbott product, the Sotoxa device, and the bottom is Draeger, but both are very similar. They all come with an oral fluid swab, which is basically kind of an advanced cotton swab that you take out of the packaging, hand it to the motorist. The officer doesn't do the swabbing. You have the motorist rub this oral fluid swab in the mouth, under the tongue, on the cheeks, for about 30 to 45 seconds to collect enough oral fluid. How do you know that you've collected enough oral fluid? Well, there's a blue indicator that'll light up when you collected enough oral fluid to make sure that you have enough. Next slide, please. Once you've collected the oral fluid, you put the cartridge, which is that black device there above the word menu on the right side. The cartridge goes into the analyzer, and then the swab goes into the cartridge. Next slide. As soon as you put that swab into that cartridge that's in the analyzer, a countdown clock will start that takes approximately 5 minutes. And what's happening at that point, the swab is mixing with the buffer. It's going over those lateral flow strips where the dried reagents are, and it's going to give you a positive, negative result of those 6 drug classes. Next slide, please. So some have said, how new is this? Who's doing this? Well, here's a list of the states who have actively implemented some form or fashion of roadside oral fluid testing. Some states are very advanced: Alabama, Arizona, and there's others. Michigan was the first one to start the process in 2018. But other states, there's just a few departments who have purchased oral fluid testing devices. But my point is, it's no longer new or novel. It's almost like half the country is now using roadside oral fluid testing to some degree. Next slide. This slide's critically important because there's often a misunderstanding of the difference between roadside screening and confirmation evidential testing. And I'm going to focus on the left side, which is the screening. It's an investigative tool only that helps you establish probable cause for the arrest. It's not an evidential test. The sample and the analysis is conducted right there at Roadside within 5 minutes. It's only sampling 6 drug categories, like I mentioned before. It's limited to the test panel of the most common drugs we see involved with crashes. It gives you a qualitative result of positive or negative only, not a quantitative result. And it gives you that real-time information, and most critically to understand, it's not used in court proceedings. I want you to think of the roadside oral fluid screening device as analogous to a portable breath testing device. Compare that to the evidential side, the confirmation side. That's where the test goes to the laboratory. The evidential test for the samples collected post-arrest, the analysis is conducted by scientists in a laboratory. They may be testing for 80, 100, or even more chemical substances versus just the 6 that are being done at Roadside. And it's going to give you that quantitative result, and it's going to be a key piece of evidence in your court proceedings. So it's always good to remember, what is this and what is it not? It's a screening tool to help develop probable cause at Roadside. Next slide. And I show this slide here to look at the terms or the cutoff levels for each of the drugs. And I want to have you focus on cannabis. It shows you that the cutoff level is 25 nanograms to trigger a positive on the roadside oral fluid. When I first saw that, I was a little bit shocked. I was thinking 25 nanograms seem awful high when states such as Colorado are using 5 nanograms as a per se limit. Well, the reason that is because there's not a one-to-one correlation between nanograms in blood to oral fluid. So for example, 1 nanogram of THC in blood is actually equivalent to about 25 to 45 nanograms in oral fluid. So that's why you don't see that one-to-one correlation. And the cutoff levels are set, so it will not pick up therapeutic doses of prescription medications as well. Next slide. So the advantages: it's quick, it's easy, it's a simple tool to put into the hands of your law enforcement officers. It's going to tell you what the free drug is that's circulating in the blood. It's going to tell you the recency of use, not if somebody used a drug a week ago, 2 weeks ago, or a month ago. It's going to tell you that they've used it recently. You don't need any medical personnel on scene to do the collection. You can do it yourself. It detects the parent drug, and it aids in your investigation. It's a step in the process after you do your SFSTs to determine what is causing the driver to be impaired. And most importantly, I think, is it creates a general deterrence. There's a lot of folks out there who are driving who don't think law enforcement have the tools to detect impairment. And they're right. This is not a tool to detect impairment. Only the DRE can detect impairment, but it creates a general deterrence that motorists will know that law enforcement does have a way to determine if someone has used a substance in the recent past. Next slide. This slide's critically important, and we use this a lot of times with the legislature because sometimes legislators think that we're pulling people over, we're rolling down the window, and we're sticking this oral fluid swab in somebody's mouth. That's not how it happens, as you well know. You still need to have your vehicle in motion. You still need to make personal contact with the driver. All the same procedures you're currently following. That's when you do your pre-arrest screening, all of your SFST tests. And then that's typically when you do your PBT. And now it's time to do that roadside oral fluid test. Once the oral fluid test is done and the PBT is done, now you have established your probable cause for your arrest. And now you can seek your warrant for an evidential blood draw, collect your samples, or call a drug recognition expert. So it's important to know where in the process the oral fluid is being collected. Next slide. So this slide's a little bit outdated. I think we're up to 25 states now that have authorized oral fluid in some form or fashion. You'll see the state of Minnesota is in purple because they have a pilot program that was initiated via statute. Michigan was the same way in 2018. They had a very good pilot program. And then there's other states that have authorized it for either evidential testing or for roadside testing. But I want to point out that even the gray states, that just means that their statute is silent on oral fluid testing, but that doesn't mean that they can't do it. What it means is that if you, as a law enforcement officer, ask somebody in California or Texas or New Mexico to take an oral fluid test and they refuse, there's no penalty for the refusal, but you can still do the testing in those states. Next slide. 4 ways to implement roadside testing that's been done in this country to date. The first box was the way Michigan did it in 2018. They're kind of the leader, the gold standard on this program. And Minnesota, which started their pilot program just this January. That's where the legislature said, we want you to run a pilot for 1 year, 2 years, or however long it is. We want you to buy 100, 200 analyzers, and we want you to do a pilot program. And then we'll come back in a year and look at those results to see if we want to include the collection of roadside oral fluid in our statute. So that's the way those 2 states did it. The second box is the way Indiana did it and the way Arizona did it. They said, we don't need a pilot. Too many pilots have been done. We know it's successful. So what the Highway Safety Office did is they went out and bought 100, 200 units, distributed them to law enforcement agencies in their state at their choosing with an MOU, and the state collected all this data, and we'll hear from Indiana in a moment. The third way, your law enforcement agency has some money and they want to buy them for themselves. They can buy the devices and start implementing use at their department level. And that's the third way it's been implemented. And then the fourth way, Alabama, just like the State Highway Safety Office buying a bunch of units and handing them out, in Alabama, the forensic laboratory did so. So 4 ways to implement a program. Next slide. So I really want to focus on the state of Michigan because they were kind of the first ones to delve into this. They led the way in the path forward. They were the early pioneers, and the success that we've seen in other states can be tied back to the work in Michigan. Because of the tragic death of Barbara and Thomas Swift, the Swift law was passed in Michigan, which implemented this roadside oral fluid pilot testing program. They began at small, 5 counties, and they selected 31 DREs. They collected 92 oral fluid roadside samples, and they found 100% accuracy rate for amphetamines, meth, and opioids, and a very high 85.7% accuracy rate for benzos, cocaine, and THC. And that accuracy rate may not be 100%, and there are reasons for that. You may test positive for THC at a preliminary roadside test, but by the time the blood is collected 3 hours later, it may show negative. So there is that reason for those lesser accuracy rates. And there's also problems with benzodiazepines as well, because the roadside oral fluid testing device may be testing for certain benzos, and then the laboratory may be testing for a larger panel of those. And I think Chris and the lieutenant will talk a little bit about that moving forward. Next slide. So the phase 1 project was such a success that Michigan said, let's expand our pilot, which they did in 2019, to all 69 counties in the state with 131 DREs, and they did 661 roadside oral fluid tests. Next slide. So what they found out of these 2 tests, these 2 phases, was that oral fluid was found to be accurate for the purposes of preliminary roadside testing. Now they have a bill in front of their legislature that would authorize preliminary roadside screening in Michigan, establishing parity with their preliminary breath testing. So they found the success. You can Google oral fluid Michigan phase 1, phase 2, and read these reports. They're not that long, but you can see those reports and how well their pilot program went. Next slide. So there's more success, and I'm just going to focus on these 2 states, Michigan and Alabama. Alabama has been doing both roadside and evidential roadside or oral fluid testing for years. They too found that oral fluid is a valuable specimen for DUID applications. Over 5 years, THC and cocaine were detected at a positivity rate of 90% and 97% in oral fluid versus 75% and 44% in blood. So those are some pretty staggering numbers there. All tested devices had performance rates exceeding 90%, and false positives and false negatives were very low, 2 and 7%. They had very strong support from the DRE program, their TSRPs, local attorneys, and judges, tox labs, et cetera. And the point that I want to make here too, because I'm talking a lot about DREs, we found coming out of Michigan, they gave their devices to DREs. They really don't belong in the hands of DREs. Your DREs are your experts. They're the ones who can detect impairment doing their 12-step DRE evaluation. What we've found moving forward is that these devices are best in the hands of your patrol officers and your officers who've had A-RIDE training and not the DREs. Next slide. So speaking of DREs, we've also heard that this is a way to get rid of the DRE program. And I can't emphasize this enough. Absolutely not. These are roadside screening devices only to help determine probable cause. They do not detect impairment. That's what the DRE is for. This just helps you build your probable cause for arrest. The result is used to support the officer's opinion, and it's just a tool. It's a tool that assists with the DRE investigation, providing you real-time chemical test information. And current oral fluid screening devices do not test for all impairing substances. And so a DRE will always be needed forever and ever. Next slide. So now that you've decided you're all in, you want to get involved with roadside oral fluid testing, you got to stop a minute and think, how are we going to implement a program? And Chris and Lieutenant are going to talk about Indiana's program, but you really want to move slowly and think about it. Who's our statewide coordinator? Is there a statewide coordinator that's going to be collecting data from all of the law enforcement agencies that are doing roadside testing to make sure that all the agencies in the state have the same standard operating procedures? You don't want to have, different procedures in one jurisdiction versus another jurisdiction. When will quality control checks be done? How will training be done? Will you tell the DRE when they show up what the result was of the roadside screening? We recommend you don't, so it doesn't prejudice the DRE. Who will be charged with training? And finally, what data do you want to collect? You're going to hear from Indiana that they started collecting really good data. So a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, you have the data to show that your roadside oral fluid testing has been successful. Next slide. And finally, there's additional uses for roadside oral fluid screening other than doing it at roadside for drivers. It can be used for random testing at a jail or in an intake setting. It can be used at drug courts, right? It's going to give the judge an immediate result of whether or not the person has recently used. And then there's widespread applicability for probation and parole. Think about community supervision. When you go on field visits, it can be used to test your probationers. It's non-invasive. There's no needle stick. It's gender neutral. And think about it, it's less traumatic than urine testing when you have sexual assault or trauma victims. So there's a lot of different uses for it, in addition to the roadside testing, in the jail setting, in the community supervision setting. It's being used across the world and across the US for workplace safety testing as well. So there are additional uses. Next slide. All right, I will hand it back to you, Sheriff. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we can all see that Chuck is well versed in the oral fluid program. Thank you for sharing. Also, let me remind you, if you have questions during the presentations, if you'll go to the chat box and type those questions in, we have a Q&A session at the end of the program. Our next speakers are Chris Kirby and Lieutenant Casey Lehman. As the Northeast Region and Impaired Driving Enforcement LAL for Indiana, Chris helps train officers and provides equipment from the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute. He also implements traffic safety measures, including checkpoints. He joined the Indiana Highway Traffic Safety Department in 2021 after serving the Muncie Police Department for over 30 years. He served as a road sergeant, traffic unit commander, traffic crash reconstruction traffic commander, SFST and DRE instructor, and hostage negotiator. He also served as a deputy coroner for the Delaware County, Indiana, and served in the Army as a military police officer. Casey has been a patrol lieutenant with the Elkhart County, Indiana Sheriff's Office since 2005. He has made over 1,000 impaired driving arrests. Casey served on the SWAT team for 15 years as a sniper and team commander, and now oversees the crash investigation team as a reconstructionist. He is a phlebotomist, an SFST instructor, and a DRE. Casey spearheaded the Elkhart County Sheriff's Office Unmanned Aerial Vehicle Program, which now has a fleet of 5 UAVs and 6 licensed pilots. We look forward to hearing about the success from each of you and your traffic safety efforts in Indiana.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you're at. In Indiana, in October of 2020, the Traffic Safety Division issued approximately 80 instruments across the state. I was still on the street as a sergeant with the Muncie Police Department, and I was in one of those initial trainings. The reason that Indiana wanted to implement a roadside oral fluid program, the why of our program was because we were seeing 2.5 to 3 times more drug impaired driving in Indiana than what we were alcohol. We were trying to combat that with a limited number of DREs and a limited number of ARIDE trained officers. So we wanted to increase the effectiveness of our DUI enforcement and reduce impaired driving, therefore reduce fatal crashes. The changing topography in Indiana increased the need for this over the last decade. And if it hadn't been for the work that had been done previously in Michigan and the pilot programs, we wouldn't have known which direction to go with this. Their work in Michigan was substantial, and it was enough for us to not have to run a pilot program, but instead start an implementation program. Next slide, please. So in 2020, we had 110 uses just in that period of time between October and the end of the year. The emphasis originally was placed on our urban areas, the bigger cities like Fort Wayne and Indianapolis, and Evansville, and where I was in Muncie. And so we were able to have 110 uses in 2020. Next slide. In 21, the focus changed to concentrate more on the data collection and the training. That's when I became part of the Traffic Safety Division, and I was tasked with training and retraining officers on not only how to use the instruments or the analyzers, but why to use them. And as we all know, why is so important in everything that we do. And so we had 879 total uses in 21. We also did a study and presented at the National DRE conference in San Antonio the results of our study. And what we found when we initially looked into doing this was that our benzodiazepines, our accuracy was really low. We couldn't understand why. So in inquiring with some of our friends in the toxicology world, we found out that if you take alprazolam, which is Xanax, and it's our major benzodiazepine that we see in Indiana, as I'm sure it is all over the country, if you add fluoride to that and you make it flualprazolam, it will hit positive on our roadside instruments, but our lab may not test for flualprazolam. So we found this to be true in Indiana. We, through the Department of Transport, or I'm sorry, through the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute, sent those blood draws off to another lab to be tested. And sure enough, they came back positive for flualprazolam. So that brought our percentages back up to where we would want them to be. And that was the work that was done in 21. Next slide. In 22, we shifted our focus from the urban areas to urban and rural areas. And we had approximately 500 officers receive ARIDE training, and this seemed to be the catalyst. I know that our uses went down, but there was a period of time, an extended period of time, that we ran into a supply and demand issue. We weren't able to get cartridges because the supply chain was down because of resurgence of COVID. Once that picked up, you'll see that our numbers started to go up. With what we started to do is at the end of ARIDE training, we would train our officers on roadside oral fluid. Not only when to use the instrument, or the analyzer, and not only how, but why they're using it. And we'll touch on why at the end of my part of this session. Next slide, please. In 2023, the sheriff's offices in Indiana took the lead in the tests that had been ran, to include Elkhart County. And you're going to hear from Lieutenant Casey Lehman, who's not only a DRE and a good friend of mine, but he's also our top user in roadside oral fluid, or his department is the top user in roadside oral fluid. His department, he is the top user, or I'm sorry, top evaluator as far as DRE evaluations. And he's our lead phlebotomist in the state. So the thought that the areas in your state or in our state that was receiving the least amount of services were the ones that needed this equipment the most. So we continued to push those out into the rural areas. We also included more ARIDE courses through the leadership of our traffic safety office, which has been absolutely phenomenal in promoting and pushing for everything that we can put together to save lives in Indiana. We were able to we're going to do 30 ARIDE trainings again this year and 30 ARIDE classes again next year. The other monumental thing that happened in 2023 is that we implemented usage through the Indiana State Police. And with those ISP posts that are located all over the state, and the usage numbers that are coming back, 2024 is going to be another big year. In 2023, we had over 1,400 uses of roadside oral fluid. Next slide, please. What that does is it saves lives. I can't emphasize enough. In 2022 in Indiana, we unfortunately had over 970 lives lost on our roadways. And we can break that down in any demographic you want. We can put that in gender, we can put it in race, we can put it in type of roadway, we can put it in type of vehicle. And it's a number. And that's what it stays until it's not. That's a number until it's someone knocking on your door. someone that calls you mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, you folks know, and because you're part of the solution, that that what we have to do is we put everything that we can into saving lives. And I'm proud to report that in Indiana in 2023, we had a reduction for the first time in decades of lives lost, and we were down over 9% in fatal crashes. So the work that is being done, and you can buy all the instruments you want. You can have all the trainings, we can have all the conferences, we can have all the webinars we want, but without the traffic stop, without the officer on the road doing the work, it's pointless. So I appreciate everything that you folks do, and the why of what we put together and what we've been able to accomplish in Indiana is simply to save lives. Next slide. This is my contact information. If you need me, please reach out. Thank you.
All right, so I am Casey Lehman. I'm a lieutenant with the Elkhart County Sheriff's Office, and I'm going to touch on some of our local results that we've had to piggyback off what Chris had to say, and really to the point of what Indiana has been doing. We've been providing the training with our state. Indiana Criminal Justice Institute has stepped in and really helped out with increasing the number of DREs in the state of Indiana and building up a program that is doing wonders to save lives in our state. So again, we'll go into some of our local results that we've got with implementation of the Setoxa. Next slide. So our local success, and to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of our where we come from, we're right in the north central part of the state of Indiana. So marijuana is still illegal in Indiana, and we butt up right next to Michigan. So we see a lot of issues with our citizens or anybody that works in our county that goes up to Michigan and then brings marijuana back into the state of Indiana. So it becomes an issue here locally with that purpose. So since we deployed our Setoxa in April of 2020, we have had 71 usages, and this was as of last weekend. We had quite a few more since the weekend where we have used it, but this is up until last weekend. We've had 10 of those tests out of the 71 that came back negative. So that's only a 14% negative rate that we've had when we've had somebody to on a traffic stop that was under the influence of something other than alcohol. Of these tests, there were 61 positive tests. So that's an 86% test rate of a positive test on all of those usages that we've had. When we look and break down the drug use, we have 26 out of those 71, or for 43% of the tests were single drug use. And of those with 2 or more drugs, we had 23 tests with positive, which is a 37% positive rate with multi-drug for 2. And then finally for 3 drugs, we've had 12 positive tests, or 20% of those total tests have come back to 3 drugs in those different tests. So 57% of the tests that have a positive result, out of that, that was the test that tested positive, we had 57% of them that resulted in a positive test for poly drug use, or 49% of the total number of tests. So we're looking at approximately 50%, or half the tests that we conduct on those who we believe to be impaired on something. We're getting a high number of test results that are coming back for poly drug use. On the right side, this is just an example of one of the tests that I ran on someone, and you can see that this person specifically tested positive for a CNS stimulant for cocaine, and also tested positive for cannabis. So that's what we're looking at. We're seeing a lot of testing of positive testing for the cannabis, methamphetamine, cannabis, and cocaine. So a majority of the tests that we're seeing coming back are that of cannabis mixed with something else. Next slide. Since implementation, we've had testing of 36 of those tests that we use the Setoxa on that we've been able to actually pair up with a blood draw result. So out of these 28 or out of the 36, we've had 28 that have matching positive results. 3 were not matching, where a drug came back to either positive on the Cetoxa and negative on the blood, or vice versa. And then we had 3 that were negative for drugs and on both the Cetoxa and the blood. And then finally, we had 2 Cetoxa that were negative, but the blood came back positive for another drug that was not in the panel. So we can see the majority of the time that we use the Cetoxa, it's actually what it's picking up a drug that the person is on. So it's the panel that is being tested for is picking up a majority of the drugs that are being used out on our streets. Next. You can see here, this goes back into what Chuck had to say about the different drug categories, and you can see the cutoffs for each one and how that matches up on the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. So the different drug categories, you can see this one here specifically was the cocaine positive and the cannabis positive, and the different cutoffs levels for that. Next. So if you have any questions, once we're done with this, if you have something that comes up or you have any need for policy or ideas that you need to bounce off of me, whether it is Cetoxa related, DRE program related, or with the law enforcement phlebotomy, you're welcome to contact me either through email or cell phone or my office phone number. And Sheriff, back to you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the presentations you both have made. So now is the time for our audience to participate. If you have questions, I haven't seen any questions yet entered into the chat box. But if there are any questions, if you would enter them there, we can ask one of our presenters if they have an answer for you. We'll give that a couple of minutes here.
Sheriff, while you're waiting, I'm going to ask a question to both Casey and Chris. Knowing now what you know about your implementation, is there anything you would have done differently if you were to do it all over again, things you've learned?
Yes, there's things that we did in 21 we tried to do a saturation in Lake County, Indiana, and only about half of those units got used in the major cities. With the crime rate the way it is in some of those places, your Garys, your Hobarts, the usage was low because they're busy with a lot of things. I think the focus with your understaffed or your lower staffed agencies that may have more time to focus on your OWIs, I think that's key. And also, if we could have started training A-RIDE sooner, not everyone should be an SRO, and not everyone should be a DRE, not everyone should be SWAT, but everybody should go to A-RIDE. It's so beneficial across the board. It's not just OWI investigations, but investigations in general. So if we could have focused more on A-RIDE in the beginning, I think our numbers would be at least doubled.
So that's to go along with that as well. So our agency has been trying to push for the A-RIDE program in Indiana. So we host here at our agency. We have been working with Chris and another one of the state coordinators to host an A-RIDE class at our agency once a year to try to get our officers through the A-RIDE program, because that's important for recognizing when somebody is impaired on something other than alcohol. And that's one thing that we have really pushed for, and I will continue to push for as long as we continue to have fatalities in our area.
Okay, we have some questions now. I'm just going to ask the question, and person that has the best information on it, if you would answer. What is the shelf life of the testing devices used in the field?
Well, my understanding is that the cartridges have a shelf life of about 18 months. Am I correct on that, Chris?
The cartridges, yes, usually about anywhere from 12 to 18 months. Make sure that you cycle them properly, because if you pass out the newer ones, the older ones may not get used. And once they expire, the instrument won't read them. So we have learned that we can use those in training, but the 12 to 18 months is the answer to that question. As far as the instruments themselves, We haven't ran into any major malfunctions with the instruments, and some of them are coming up on 4 and almost 5 years old. So it's a durable product. At least the ones that we have been.
Very good. Has there been any pushback from any prosecutors that you know of? And if there is, what was the reasoning?
Initially, some of the prosecutors in Indiana pushed back because it had not been tried. It had we don't have any case law. It hasn't been tried in court. And once they receive the training, once it's explained to them, and I love to have them in my training sessions. I love when a prosecutor's office shows up for an A-ride. But once they get the training, they love them. Cases that would normally be dismissed or pushed aside because maybe the backlog with the Department of Toxicology is too long. We have prosecutors that are holding on to those cases because they know the evidence is coming because of the analyzer. So that's working out really well for us. We even have one case out of the West Central area where the blood sample, the evidence wasn't collected, or it was collected, but it was dropped in the lab. And so we lost that evidence. The court found based on the what was in the probable cause affidavit, which included the analysis from the roadside oral fluid.
And on that, I have yet to go to court on any of the cases that I've used Acetoxa and had a positive result. Every single one of them so far has pled out.
Very good. How can I start the program in California? And can we start it with just our city, or does it have to be our county?
I can answer that one. We've done a lot of work in California. California receives the CHP has a grant program for their marijuana tax revenue. So you can apply to the CHP for grant funds to fund oral fluid testing devices and put it into a larger program. The Highway Safety Office, I know, has also been entertaining grant requests to purchase these in California. And if you know anybody at the Pittsburgh, California Police Department, they've purchased a couple of units and have been using them for a couple of years. So it's kind of just kicking off in California. But I would say either reach out to your CHP or to the Highway Safety Office because folks are already using it in California.
Very good. How often does it need to be calibrated, and who does the calibration? Texas heat can affect equipment. Is it heat tested?
So let me answer the first part of it. The quality control cartridges, which are included with the instruments that we received, need to be ran once a shift the instrument's going to be used. And that's been our standard operating procedure. It works really well. The instrument will remind you when it needs a quality control test ran. We were doing yearly services and have found that it's really not necessary because of the durability of the instrument. As far as the heat's concerned, the operating temperatures are 41 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. In Indiana, we have a climate that is strange because in February, you are looking at sub-zero temperatures, and by mid-April to early May, you could be well into the 90s. So it fluctuates back and forth a lot. And I've only had one instance where the instrument wouldn't run because it was too hot, and it was outside of that temperature range. So if you can keep it in the car, keep it cool in Texas, or keep it in the car and keep it warm in Alaska, it's going to operate for you. It has an internal heater on the instrument itself. I think your biggest concern with those going outside of those temperature ranges is your cartridges because they contain liquid.
So treat it like you would treat PBT, right?
Chuck, I was a policeman for a very long time, and I'm going to beg you to treat this better than you do your PBT.
All right.
You
Sheriff,
covered that these devices are used for roadside screenings. Does that mean the case law behind the device is primarily similar to current PBT case law, or would they have different established case law?
well, that question, Chris, I don't know if you want to talk about case law. I'm not a lawyer, and I would ask you to talk to your TSRP, but that's what we do in every state. We let the TSRP weigh in, but these are not evidential devices. They are just like your portable breath test device. They should not be called into question for evidential purposes on case law. I believe there was one case in California where this came forward and it was held up to be legit. But it should not, it's not an evidential test. It's just a screening tool at Roadside. Chris, you want to add to that?
So it shouldn't ever really be challenged because it's, like Chuck said, it's non-evidentiary. It's a screening device, and it's proven to help us a lot in Indiana as far as it going into the courtroom. The only time we've ever seen it was because they couldn't get the blood, and that was the one time that it stood. Now that hasn't been to the appellate level or any higher than that, but I'm pretty confident that the instrument will stand by itself, just the same as what the PBT does.
Hey, one question: do Casey or Chris offer presentations in other states? Should we just reach out to them individually?
Yes,
Yes.
I've been to Utica, New York. I've been to St. Louis. I'm scheduled for Biloxi, Mississippi. So the answer to that is yes. I have to follow within my state guidelines. So there are a lot of questions, but we love to share what we've done in Indiana because it works. And if we can if what we've done in Indiana, just the same with what they've done in Michigan, if we can build on that and save lives in Missouri or Kansas City, Kansas, or anywhere else in the country or world, and it takes me talking about it, then I'm willing.
Same for you, Casey.
Yes, sir.
How does the collection work if the cartridge is dropped on the side of the road? It's dark sometimes and got a lot going on.
Casey, I'll let you answer that. You've probably dealt with it more than I have. I was on days when I handled it.
So if you've dropped it and you haven't collected enough fluid with it, I wouldn't have the person stick it back in their mouth and continue swabbing. That's up to the preference. I mean, if the person wants to pick it back up and put it back in their mouth, I'm sure they've had a lot more dirty things in their mouth than just that test strip if they've gotten to that point. So it would be worth either you could offer them the option of picking it back up depending on where it fell, but I would recommend you start with a new cartridge.
Hey, if you're taking a drug for methamphetamine and you do a Sotoxa oral swab, will it test positive on the test for meth, or are there other medications that can prove positive?
Certainly. So if you let's use the drug phentermine, for example. If you're on phentermine, which has amphetamines in it, and you take that drug and you're within that window of detection, it will hit positive on the instrument or the analyzer. So again, and this emphasis has been made throughout the presentation today, there's nothing in these analyzers that proves impairment. Now, if we're doing an oral fluid sample roadside, I would hope we already have the impairment, or we wouldn't be to that step anyway. But the answer to that is yes. If you take an opiate for pain, whether you should be driving or not, that's between you and your doctor, and your roadside tests. It will also, if it's a natural opiate, it will hit positive on the analyzer.
Aside from test results, were there other data points collected that you found useful or interesting?
When we ran our study, and Chuck, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I know you can talk about Michigan all day, the same as I can talk about Indiana. When we ran our study on the tests that we had done, and we compared them to our DRE evaluations that were done either afterward or before, not allowing the DRE to know the result, the calls were not always the same. The DRE would call what was most psychoactive in the body at the time, whereas the instrument is going to pick up all of the drugs that are in the body at the time. What we found was we could find what time people were being tested, We could divide it by gender, because the questions that were allowed to ask or put into our questionnaire on our instruments is the age, gender, type of vehicle, and the reason for the incident, whether it's a stop or a crash. We were able to use those 4 points, and with that comes a ton of data. And whereas most officers on the road aren't data driven, they're results driven, they're personal experience driven. The folks that control funding love that data. So we were able to use that and show them what time of day we were using the instrument, the gender and the age, and a lot of times the location, just based on officer testimony. It has increased our DRE callouts. It has increased our DRE evaluations. There are a lot of good that have come from introducing an oral fluid program in Indiana, where at first a lot of our DREs were reprehensible about it because they felt, like it's been said before, that it would replace the DRE program, and it does just the opposite. It enhances our DRE program.
Hey, one of the questions, and we're down to the last couple of questions here. They have received money from the state to purchase a device. However, one of the requirements is to establish policy for usage of the device as well as training for them. Is there any examples of general policy?
Sheriff, what I'll say is that NASID has created an oral fluid work group that's chaired by myself and Aaron Holmes. And one of our first deliverables is going to be giving resources to states. Now that you've bought a device or wanted to buy a device, we're going to develop an implementation checklist. What are the things that you want to consider now that you've purchased a device? What kind of data should you be collecting, like Kirby was just talking about? So those resources will be forthcoming through NASID in the next couple months or so.
Very good. And the last question, are people generally open and cooperative to taking the test? We run into lots of refusals with our PVTs.
I can speak to that. So out of the total number of tests that we've done, we got to start with the number of people that have been offered a DRE. We're seeing less than a 10% refusal rate for people who refuse the DRE. And then at that point, if we offer a Sotoxa when the DRE is completed, and I know we're going kind of a little bit different with our agency where we do the DRE and then the Sotoxa. We're seeing at that point, if they've submitted to a DRE, we're seeing less than a 5% refusal rate for the Sotoxa at that point if they've completed the DRE. So that's kind of a little bit different than other agencies may be using it, but I'm not sure if there's other data out there for the ARIDE program on that.
So I polled our users in the state, in the Northeast region in particular, because that's where I'm a law enforcement liaison, and we have less than 1% refusal rate in the Northeast region, and of course Casey's part of that. So with the amount of usage that they have up there, they may see a higher percentage, but across the Northeast region and in other areas of the state, we're seeing about a 1% refusal rate. It's not bad at all.
Thank you very much. Before we close, next slide, please. Before we close, let me remind everyone that no one dies accidentally in a crash. So let's please call them what they are, and that is crashes. Next slide. Matt has created 10 impaired driving training videos available on their website. This is an appropriate one to close on.
My name is Michelle Ramsey.
Lisa Black,
Jeff Kudlasik,
Debbie Hawkins,
Shelby Strong,
Richard Liotta,
Stephanie Ronan,
Valerie McClung,
Al Hawkins,
Christine Villatoro,
Jared Swan,
and an impaired driver killed my 4-year-old son and my 6-year-old son.
An impaired driver left me severely injured in continuous pain.
An impaired driver left me permanently disabled at the age of 23.
An impaired driver killed our son.
Killed my fiance and the father of my son.
killed my son,
Left me permanently disabled, scarred for life.
Killed my 22-year-old son, Cody McClung.
killed my son, Anthony Hawkins.
An impaired driver killed my daughter Anna.
An impaired driver killed my brother.
Next slide. Again, we would like to say thanks to NSA, NASID, and responsibility.org, to our presenters today for taking their time to be with us today. We would also like to thank everyone who took time to view this and participate in the question and answer session. You each attended today because you care. Your work saves lives. Thank you for attending, and we hope you put what you learned today to work. Thank you.